Hey, Dave Melinda here, Positive Polarity Podcast. Hope things are going awesome for you. I'm super excited today because I have these questions that are like really haunting me. And so I'm going to ask you, the listener. And then when I found out where these questions came from, I'm like, I got to get this person on our show. So I'm going to ask the questions first, and then we're going to dive in. So first of all, the question was, do you capture your audience's attention? And I was like, man, my first inkling was absolutely, let's go on to the next. That was super easy, but then I had to sit with it for a little bit. And then the second one really did me in. It said, then do you emotionally connect with them, and do they connect with your brand? And now I'm like, oh my gosh. So I had to get Deirdre Tshien. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing, Dave?
Good. I'm super excited. You're the CEO of CapShow, and you're going to help us with this because I'm guessing that there's a ton of stuff out there vying for our attention. And if we don't stick out, if we don't stand out somehow, especially emotionally, we're going to kind of get just left behind. So fill me in, first of all, on what CapShow is, so we know kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, so CapShow is actually transitioning. I can totally tell you the background of CapShow, but we actually launched beta at the end of last year, and we did it like we can serve all entrepreneurs, and you can imagine how well that goes, right? When you're trying to capture attention and you're trying to, do it. Yeah. So we're actually in a transition phase right now, niching down, and we want to help business owners who podcast to actually turn their stories into a bank of captions.
Okay.
And so it's some really cool things that we're doing there. And I'm really excited actually to get into this couple of questions that you just raised. Because heaps of stuff that we can talk about there for sure.
Well, so I'm going to start with, how in the world do you capture your audience? We're making a huge assumption here, Deirdre, that we understand who our audience is. So we're just going to make an assumption. We know who they are. We've done our homework, and we got a pretty good feel of who our demographic is. Once we have that, how in the world of where we are now, how do we capture their attention? And how do we do that? To give us some help on that.
Yeah, so this kind of boils down to my core strategy, which is what I call content honey traps.
Okay.
And just kind of like how the name sounds, you want to lovingly, nurturingly trap them.
Okay. Uh-oh. Trap them with a smile on your face, right?
Exactly. But really,
while you're hitting them over the head. I love it. This is awesome.
But really designed so that they follow you through what we call your front end funnel, all the way to, with a mix of short form into your long form content. And this kind of comes back to I don't know if you've heard about the 7-hour rule, but this stems from what in Daniel Priestley's book Oversubscribed, he talks about the 7-hour rule, which is for anyone to kind of open their wallets up to you, become raving fans, they need to at least spend 7 hours with you. Now, with you could be just consuming your content in the days of, business meetings and things like that. He talks about how the Japanese do business, and they don't even broach business until they've spent a good amount of time playing golf together, going to dinners, things like that. So it's really premise on that. It's like, how can we use our short form content, set these content honey traps to get them into your long form content where you're clocking up the 7 hours, and then use content honey traps there to get them onto your email list, into your conversion event, wherever that is, where you can make the sale.
So is there something magical about the 7 hours? I mean, is that a number, I'm assuming with some research, that people need that kind of time to warm up to you, to connect with you, and to trust you? Is that kind of where that comes from?
Yeah, so he was basing it on some of the research that Google had done themselves. But I think for him, it's definitely just been like his experience, backed up by sort of what Google have said. So we've kind of just latched onto that. It just gives us a good benchmark. Kind of my, how I've kind of tested it is like, I used to do a lot of live challenges. So, 5-day challenges that end up actually being more like 9 days with bonuses and open cart time and things like that. And it always used to be like one of those, the thought of someone coming totally cold in and then converting on a high ticket, by the way, off the back of that was like, how did that happen? And I think once I kind of got across the concept of the 7-hour rule, I was like, okay, this is making sense. This is why you can very quickly in that 1 week get someone from cold to closed, essentially.
Wow.
So for me, that just essentially made sense around why that was working.
Well, and it's so funny because I'm sure you get the same things on LinkedIn that I do. Somebody wants to connect and then they connect, and within 30 seconds, they give you this big, long, list of things that you better start buying from them or your life's over. And especially from the coaching world, it's funny, I can work 3 minutes a day and make $100,000. I mean, it's crazy, right? And I'm sure it's possible and, whatever, but, how in the world does that even come close to passing the 7-hour rule? It's not even the 7-second rule, where, I mean, they're right away connecting with you. You never heard of them before. A lot of times I've never even heard of the country that they've come from. Again, no disrespect. I don't know anything about these people. Yeah. And they're kind of like, the expectation is there for there to be a instant connection. And yes, here, let me give you my credit card number. Let me give you my social security card number. I mean, it's just like, wow.
I trust you already. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, sure, absolutely. You emailed me, you're on the internet, you must be legit, right? But I gotta say, there are probably entrepreneurs listening right now, Deirdre, that are like, man, 7 hours. I'm so busy running my business. I'm so busy focusing on the bottom line, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if I can add that hat. So is that where you come in then? Or what if I'm interested in that, but in the 7-hour connection, so to speak? I want to connect with my clients. I want them to hear my message, but I don't have the time. How do you jump in then at that?
Yeah, so we can distill that 7 hours at scale into 2 to 2.5 hours a week for the CEO. And how we do that, and I do this personally in my business, I help clients do this as well, is if you think about it, you record a podcast episode, and it can be just like how we're doing that now. You have really cool conversation with someone else, or you can have your own, where you host your own podcast and you're just kind of sharing a lot of value and your own stories to your audience. That's, around about 30 minutes a week. So I co-host my own podcast with my co-founder, 30 minutes a week. Okay. And then we actually work with a very cost-effective VA who does like all of the things. Okay, so what I mean by that is that she takes that, obviously she edits up the podcast recording, drafts the show notes, and we actually have quite like a structured formula for our show notes because, again, we're all about setting those content honey traps. We want the show notes as well to be leading people to where you want them to go.
Okay.
And then, so that's kind of just the long form content part of it, which is only like one bit, because the key is what a lot of times what we don't do as podcasters. And by the way, I've been guilty of, I'm on my 5th podcast show right now, as in like I have 5 podcasts. And
wow, like, there you go.
Yeah, I could tell you that because I just love, I don't know, I'm an introvert, but I just love talking things out. And and I like for the longest time, I just was not promoting my podcast. Like, and we're just bad at this generally because we love the thing that we're talking about and creating, but then we're sometimes really bad at actually telling people that it's there. And so so that's why I say the podcast is actually only one part of it, but the bulk of it really is the marketing aspect, the getting it out there. And so how we help and how we do this in our business and how we help others is how to leverage social media in the right way to actually create those content honey traps again. So how do we capture people's attention and get them like they can't wait to listen to this podcast episode. And how we do that is a 30-minute, we call it a production planning meeting. So our VA will actually content hack, they'll find inspiration, they'll get all the concepts, they'll come to me with, this is going to be your next 9 posts or however many posts for this week, or for the next week, I should say. And we'll go back and forth about like, oh, I love this concept. Actually, can we just change this bit, blah, blah, blah. she'll then off the back of that have a list of things, reels, videos, images, things that she wants me to do. That takes me like literally 10 to 15 minutes after the meeting to go ahead and record. I give her my raw files, and then she edits everything. And then Thursday we have a planning meeting, and then that's it. So that in the space of a week, 2.5 hours end to end. So for those busy entrepreneurs, I mean, if you cannot spend 2.5 hours to get to create awesome content and get it out there so that you're helping your audience clock up those 7 hours so they by the time they get on a sales call, they're ready to buy. Like, I don't know. I can't,
Oops. Well, and it's interesting because you're talking about content here. So in one venue, one way that you do it is with podcasting, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So, that doesn't mean that everybody listening has to jump on a podcast tomorrow. Find your own way to get your content out there, because I think if I'm understanding what you're saying, Deirdre, that content equals trust. It's even more enjoyable when somebody connects with me and they, lay this big, long thing out for me. And then I go, well, I better look at their site or their, their profile. And it's like, there's hardly anything there. Now there's no content and they're trying to, jump the gun, so to speak. So, tell me about content. We hear that word all the time, and it's probably the latest buzzword, but how does an entrepreneur selling, making, servicing, whatever, how in the world do they carve that time now out of their week to create content? What's your definition of content? Let me start there.
Yeah, so content is really how your audience can best connect with you. So all the things that you were saying before about like creating that trust, essentially the know, like, trust, right? We always default to, they need to know, like, and trust you. It all does come down to content, because they need to, like, there's two parts of content, well, three really, but I'm going to focus on two parts right now, that you kind of have to bring to life, and that's the value that you provide. Because and this is what I found actually in my own journey, even right now, where when I was, serving all entrepreneurs, like my content was just so broad and random, to be honest. When I thought that I was giving value, people would look at that or read that or watch that and be like, oh, she's not talking to me, because when you try to talk to everyone, you talk to no one, right? But now that I'm kind of like more and more niching, the great thing is that I can produce specific, valuable content for that person, so that as soon as they sit there, like, yes, this person knows my pains, this person knows what I need, this person knows me, right? They know. That's kind of where we want to get to. So that's one part of it, is the value that you can provide. You want them to very quickly have them know that you've got their back. And then the other part of it, which is really then the connection part, is stories. Like, it always comes back to stories. And that's why I love these types of podcasts and listening to these types of podcasts, because it's all about stories. It's all about that journey. It's all about what were the experiences that you went through? How can you peel back the layers and be completely vulnerable and be like, this is where I'm at my journey. I'm not perfect. I'm not at the top of the mountain. I may just be one step ahead of you, but I can still share, just being one step ahead of you, what that takes, right? What does it take to go from where you are to where I am, and what were all the pitfalls along the way? How did I, like, what were the highs, what were the lows? That story is what connects people. So those are the two parts that I always default back to: stories and value.
Well, and thanks for sharing that. I'm just curious, how in the world does a introvert like yourself get vulnerable? Because whether you're an entrepreneur, that V word is just, it's an up and coming word in today's business. In the 70s and 80s, long before you were born, there wasn't even, vulnerable. Oh my gosh, no. That was like showing weakness. That was the opposite. You walked in and you could have been limping from a broken leg, but the last thing you're showing is any type of vulnerability at all. So where did that change, or how are people using that as a positive today in these stories?
Yeah. And I've got to tell you, like, for me personally, it's only been something that I've been trying to get better at
Okay.
myself for the last few years. I'm just trying to actually remember exactly when, because a mentor of mine actually started talking to me about it.
Okay.
And he, okay, so a little bit of my journey
Yeah.
real quickly is, I was born in the 80s and born into obviously an Asian family. So you layer on that the whole like having to save face, that concept. And so for me, like, a vulnerability was totally a weakness. It was totally like, you cannot show anyone when things are going bad, or when you don't have money, or you're not successful. I was like tutored from 3rd grade. I had to go to the best high school, the best, like my parents wanted me to do medicine. I did law instead. Like, it's, it's just things like that where you're like, it's the constant, and it was so when I was in corporate, I was actually in an investment bank in Sydney. And I had a mentor who I was actually he was actually my boss's boss. And we were talking, and I was kind of like, why didn't I get promoted? That was like the conversation. Like, I deserve to be promoted. It was a really hard conversation for me to have, because I'm generally not like that, but that was the gist of it, right? Like, and he he just asked me this question of like, why do you even want to be promoted?
Yeah.
Right. And for me, it was like, well, why wouldn't you? It's like, that's just, like, duh, why wouldn't you?
That's a good question though. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it was the first time I've ever been asked that. And I was like, wow, I actually don't. And he actually put me on to Brene Brown, who's like, amazing about, she researches vulnerability and things like that and change. And I started just devouring her stuff. And from that, and then, so that was in my corporate, and that was the start of my journey. And then, like a couple of years ago, we started our coaching business.
Okay.
And that was when I was like, because I had to become the face of the brand. Sure. And that was when I was like, okay, we're going to have to cut through in a different way. And that is going to have to be about this journey that we're on, and the journey that I have been on, and the ups and the downs and the failures. And yeah, when you share stories like that, then people look at it, because no one wants to buy from, like, because we don't buy from invulnerable people. Like, that's the counterintuitive thing. Like, when we look at our buying, well, definitely for me, like, I always buy from people who are so open about their failures, who are so giving in that way. Sure. So then I'm like, so why do we think that on the other side we have to be that person who's like got it all figured out, when that's just not reality? And so I started really meaningfully in the last 2 to 3 years pulling back those layers. And I tell you, I'm still trying to do it. Like, I'm still like, I've gotten to the point, I think I'm getting better, and I'm accelerating it to the point where like, I used to hate bad photos of myself. I used to hate like really, videos that showed me in a not great light or whatever, right? But now
we're always our own worst critic, right?
Yeah. And what was really funny was I just had a production planning meeting with my VA, and we were looking at a TikTok that she was going to do. And it was based on this video that my co-founder took. So we were in Mexico, and I was doing the zip line thing, and like I was like kind of upside down on the zip line, and I actually forgot to untangle myself, because you're meant to so you're upside down, but then you're meant to like go right way up before you hit the water. Yeah. And I totally misjudged that. And so I hit the water, my head, I flipped, my legs were like, it was just a ridiculous video of me, right?
And they got it on video, right? Absolutely.
Video, yeah. And like, seriously, me like 2 years ago would have been mortified at that, getting out there and like mortified. But now I'm like, that's actually really funny. Like, if I can laugh at myself, like that's when, I think that's the power of being, because when you can laugh at yourself, other people can laugh at you, and we're all having fun, right? So.
Yeah, but it is hard. I mean, and I commend you for jumping outside your comfort zone in order to do that, because there's not a lot of people that feel comfortable sharing that. I was just at an association event, and I was speaking there, and I said, we were talking about communication, and I said, why don't we start off by everybody, let's go around the room and you tell us your deepest, darkest secret, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, there's no way in the world, right? And it wasn't that I was even anticipating anyone would do it, but boy, even for people that it's hard to share that with people, because that is a sign of weakness. But somehow we have to work through it, like you said, and turn it into something that's a strength or a positive, or a connection point. Because if you share something that you're vulnerable about, it makes it so much easier for me in communication to share what's vulnerable for me, but if you're not sharing anything and your wall is up, way over your head, and you're super, closed minded and closed mouth, it's harder to say, hey, let me share you something, let me tell you one here, So your customers, if I'm understanding it, then your customers are really looking for that vulnerability as well. Once they see that, what kind of, do they just see, oh, that person's more human, that company's real? I mean, is that kind of what happens once that vulnerability shows up?
Yeah, well, that's where the connection gets created, because as we know, through stories and through vulnerability is where we share and evoke emotions. Because every time we tell a story, we might think that we don't have really great stories to tell, but what the power of telling stories is that no one's actually listening to your story. They're actually listening to their story in a way, right? They're hearing their story in their own frame, with their own perspective. And so that's why it's so powerful to create that connection, because every time I tell a story, and it could be any story about, like, maybe it's a business failure or something, right? You'll probably hear it, and you'll be thinking of all your business or all these things that you went through, and you'll be like, oh, I have something in, like, that I can connect with this person. And so that's why that's so powerful, for sure.
So, what do you do for an entrepreneur that's listening that, has a product or service that's not sexy? That's not like, how in the world am I going to make a story out of whatever, plumbing, or I don't care, I don't want to, disrespect anybody. So I'm just going to leave it at, how do you possibly, how do you possibly have a story? Or quite frankly, the other part of your thing too, as we transition over into that, is that emotional connection. So an emotional connection is really important. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I believe that people, they buy emotionally, but they make decisions intellectually. They want it, but then something in the back of their mind is justifying, well, I need it, and oh my gosh, it makes life so much easier, right? So you have this intellectual and emotional fight going on. But I'm just curious, how do you possibly turn a non-sexy product or service into a story that somebody's going to remember? This one I've been waiting to ask you, because I'm like super excited to understand this.
Yeah, so let's take I'm sure that plumbers have a super exciting life and super exciting job, but let's take the plumber example.
Sure.
So instantly what comes to mind is, obviously knowing who your target audience is. Let's assume that that's down pat, as you said before. What off the back of that is going to be, okay, these are the things that are important to them that I'm going to talk about. And the way that we bring that up in stories is two ways. So either one, I start from the end and go, okay, well, if this is the value that I want to impart, because the other lens to, again, why stories are so powerful is because that is what sticks in people's mind, right? So if I just went straight into, here are the top 3 tips, people are going to be like, awesome, but move on, or very quickly forget that, because that's not, again, what sticks. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, how can I tell a story that actually brought me to the point of realization or epiphany or something, for then those tips to fall off the back of it. So for a plumber, it could be, this is what happened in my, like, let's say the value that they want to bring is, and I don't know much about plumbing, so I'm going to totally watch this and make stuff up, but like, like cleaning pipes, like I don't know, cleaning a gutter. Is that I don't know. Okay, let's say
no clue. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
You and I know about the same amount of plumber stuff, so I got a guy I just call when I need plumbing done, right? So
Okay, so let's just pretend that cleaning the gutter is something that plumbers help with. I don't think it even is, but like let's just pretend that it is. Then and so if the value is like, hey, here's how you could do it yourself once a month or whatever, and here are the 3 tips, then it's like, okay, what's the story that I can tell that can lead me to that point, which could be your own story, like, hey, this is what happened when I didn't do this, and this is what made me realize, and therefore this is what I've done. These are the 3 tips of the back of it. If that makes sense. The other way to do it is like, there would be so many client stories, so many that I think even a plumber could talk about, about a family that he went to help, or like Dave, when Dave gave me a call and he was struggling with this issue, and and bringing that situation to life through a story is a really, really powerful way of doing it too.
Awesome. Well, and I think that third-party testimonials are also huge content, because it's one thing for me to tell you how great I am at whatever I do. It's completely different if somebody that has worked with me said, oh my gosh, this guy's awesome at whatever I'm talking about. So I think you can kind of use third-party testimonials. You can also have them tell their story. And I think it's way better when somebody else praises you than when you praise yourself. So I think that that's a cool way to kind of bring in a different perspective in that. So the question though that I do have is, I do a lot of work with DISC, the personality profiling. And so I'm aware that there's different personalities in our world. There's 4 primary, if you buy into it. If not, no big deal. There's still 4, even if you don't buy into it. But there's these different personality profile, different personalities, I'm going to say. And certain people are probably more, they have a propensity to be more storytelling, more emotional, more touchy-feely type of a person, as opposed to, and again, I'm going to offend a bunch of people, engineers, who tend to really be more about the facts. It's like straight and narrow. It's a yes or no answer, and neither one are good or bad. They're just different. So how do you help somebody with the emotional connection with their brand if it's somebody that's very that's not into the emotional part to start with? They're not built that way. Have you come across that yet?
Honestly, I haven't, because I found that most of the entrepreneurs that we work with are on the like IS and then D side. Okay. So me personally, I'm a high D. Okay. And I've always been a high D, and only, as I said, as I've transitioned with my own vulnerability and unpacking my own emotions, things like that, my I skyrocketed. But now I think that I'm more comfortable with that. My D is just like, it's just come back up. So I think that that's the thing, right? We all transition through, in that moment, in that environment, what it is that we need to be flexing into. And so, definitely like task, like, because that's me, high D, very task, very like, I'm very driven, all of those. It is possible, right? It is possible to flex it to. You just have to know it and believe it, and then do it. And once you do it, I think that's when we kind of, we go on that journey, and our behaviors and personality starts to transition with that. But, for me, I went back to my core of like, I'm a high D. I'm just like, my poor team, high S's and high C's. I'm constantly having to be like, I appreciate you.
Exactly.
So like, on to the next thing.
Well, I kind of figured that at the beginning, because I felt when I said before we jumped on the call, I'm like, we're going to last about 35 or 40 minutes, and high D's are like, man, that's about all I can handle, because, if I would have said this is a 2.5-hour podcast, Deirdre, you'd have been like, not today. I got stuff I got to do, so there's stuff piling up as we speak. So I appreciate, again, you hanging out with us. But you talked about something as we start to come in for a landing today. You talked about something about like the self-awareness piece, and it's interesting because if you're not aware, if you're not self-aware, aware of yourself, it can be hard to make an assumption, I think, that all my audience loves me, they always follow me, and they'll follow me wherever. I mean, that self-awareness piece really comes in. You talked about it also for yourself on being an introvert. So where did you get that for yourself, the self-awareness? Do you remember where that kind of came from? Because that's definitely a learned skill, and it's not something that just comes natural. So I just was curious if anything, jumps to the surface when you think about that.
Yeah, super interesting question. Wow. Okay, so I'm actually literally in the moment trying to think back to, was there like a moment or
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yep. I could see your head going. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm waiting to hear what comes up. And if nothing, that's fine. I just was curious because most self-aware people, they kind of like, for me, I know the first time I took an EQ, an emotional quotient assessment, and it says your self-awareness is here. And it's just like, oh my gosh, are you kidding? I mean, I have that many blind spots. And then all of a sudden I made the conscious decision to actively work on it. And so I just didn't know if there was like something like that happened for you. So
I think it was probably a little bit more gradual. I can tell you that when I was, and my husband, so we've been together since like high school, since 9th grade or something. So
nice.
a long time. And so he can tell you almost the journey, because hilariously, I used to be not hilariously, but I used to not be very self-aware at all, to the point where, like, again, high D, I was like, I'm always right. So end of story.
Don't bother. Don't even question it. Next.
Yeah. And the call it the gift or the curse of me being, having, I think I mentioned my background of like, I went to a really top selective school. Like, so you have to take a test to get into there, obviously into a good university with a good degree, like you have to take a test. So I've always been like rewarded for my intelligence and for my, like I know, like I'm right, things like that. I've always kind of been rewarded for that. And I think it was only when I got into the real world. So actually like going into corporate, having to actually deal with different personalities, having to actually now work out, oh, it's not just me and everyone's going to listen to me. And, I now have bosses and other people I have to influence. And I think that was through that process was when I had to become a lot more self-aware of.
Gotcha.
Yeah, like how I was connecting with other people and, having to realize that I'm not always right.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's even harder for a D. So thanks for being vulnerable and sharing that. We can edit this out if you want. So if you don't want to tell people you were on, that's fine. But I mean, it's just funny because it's so it hits you in the face early in your career. Like unless you're a solopreneur and you never have communication with anybody, it's a lot less likely. But there's plenty of people that show up the first day of work and they're just like, oh my gosh, I have to acclimate my way to their way, or high D's, we expect them to acclimate to our way. I'm a high D as well. So well, thanks for sharing that. I got a couple of off the topic questions. I just personally wanted to learn more about the chalk pot and the stacks on burgers, because you co-founded this and it made me hungry when I thought about burgers and chocolate. So how in the world does this have anything to do with, CapShow? Or maybe they have nothing to do, and it's just really some fun high D stuff that you're involved with.
Yeah, so we opened, so the Chalk Pot was actually my first business, and I co-founded that with my husband. Okay. So that was 9 years ago that we started that, and it was just one of those things where at the time I knew that corporate wasn't going to be for me. He was actually studying medicine, was hating it, and so we were at this crossroads of like, what in the world do we do? Sure. And he actually, because we had kind of moved out together, and he was loving cooking and specifically loving baking. Okay. I love desserts. And so it was kind of like, well, maybe we just do this. Yeah. So completely naive, completely like, it was, hospitality is not the business to get into if it's your first business. And if you don't even have a background in hospitality, like we didn't even like casually or part-time work in, like none of that. So it was tough. It was a tough business to get into, but we made it work. We grew that to 5 locations in Sydney. we then alongside it built a burger restaurant. We had 2 of those locations. And the reason why that came about was because we were looking for a central kitchen for our dessert bar. And we came across this site that, great location, great rental rate, but it was humongous.
Okay.
And I'm like, I think there's something else that we can do here too, because the dessert bar is great for like after lunch, after dinner.
Sure.
We're like, what if we created something that was for lunch and for dinner? Sure. Then we could capture, and so that's where the burger restaurant came about as well.
Wow.
That's so
cool. Yeah, that's so cool. We talk a lot about that intersection of personal growth and business growth. And there's a lot of people that listen that really wish they could start their own company. I'll never forget. I had somebody on the show and their statistics said 70% of people in the US in the workforce want to start their own business, yet only 7% actually do. And so it's like, wow, there's this either pent up demand or pent up desire. And so I always try and ask people about that intersection where, when did you know, like you said, it wasn't even like you just said, I knew corporate wasn't for me. I was like so nonchalant. There wasn't like this big, I thought about it for years. No, it just wasn't for me, right? Because you're ID and that's how things go. But I was just curious. I mean, did the passion that you had for cooking and baking, was that enough? Because you didn't have the background, you didn't have the education for that particular piece. Was that enough for you guys to make it? Or obviously it's still going, so there must be some success there.
Yeah, so Ash, my husband, is the kind of the creative brain behind the food part of it. Okay. I'm much more the business mind. You can probably tell Heidi. I'm like, okay. And one of the first things that a mentor of mine told us to do when we just had our one little store in Burwood, like our first ever store, he was like, you've got to start systemizing. And I'm like, but we only have this one little store and everyone like knows what they to do. And he's like, no, you've got to start systemizing. So
typical C, right? Typical C guy, right? It's like, you got to systemize everything. That's like, oh man.
And I'm like, and I don't know, I'm sure MBTI, but I'm like a high N, right? So even like high N, high D, I'm like, what? You're telling me that I have to get into like the weeds of it? Like,
yeah, no interest here.
Exactly. Yep. But I'm also very coachable. So I was like, okay, fine. If you tell me to do it, I'm going to do it. So that's what we did. We systemized, and that honestly is how we were able to scale relatively quickly. I don't even know if this is answering your question. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to know if I want the people listening to know, what signs. I mean, they're always like, when do I start? Should I? Blah, blah, blah. I just want to know if that passion was enough for you to make it work, or, did it not work?
Yeah. So at the beginning, the passion was kind of all we had. A passion and a will to survive. Yeah. I think was because, and I joke about hospitality being like the hardest first business, and I'm not joking, but because you're on the hook, right? Lease, debt before date, you even open, wages, supplies. So we had to make it work. Like we had to find a way to make it work. We had no other option. Yeah. Now when I'm like, I look at online businesses and I'm like, it is so easy to give up. It's so easy to quit because it's like very little capital, very little, it's very easy to be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Yep. And that's great for people who are like, they just want to like give it a go and try it. But at the same time, I know the different, like, because I've been in both. I've been fortunate because I've always had a co-founder. Sure. Which made a difference because Ash was in the business full time. I was still working. Sure. I had to pay the debt off. Yeah.
And he appreciates that, by the way.
Right? Yeah, it's total sugar mama move right there. Yeah, but now I'm full time in our business, and my co-founder is as well. Like we're both full time in it. Awesome. And the difference that makes psychologically to be like, you got to make this work. Like there is no other option because you don't have a fallback. I think that was a really, really important key for people who are like to take away those options because then they have to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point because all the money came up front before you ever had a dollar coming in. Whereas, it might cost $20 for a set of business cards and $20 for a website if you do it yourself. And, for $40, you're in business, whatever that looks like. And as opposed to the thousands and thousands of dollars that you guys and time that you had to invest up front. So that's probably a really good, tip for people listening that are considering, do I start my own business? I think, I hear a lot of times I don't have the income, or I need the income, or I need the steady this or whatever. So did you transition along the way, or did you just jump out of corporate and then jump into these two ventures, or the initial Chalkpot adventure? Did you start with just that?
So I was still working when we opened the Chalkpot. Yeah. Because as I said, it costs a lot to fit out a place, which we did not know, again, being totally naive.
Yeah.
So as I said, we were in a lot of debt. So I kind of had to work to pay that off.
And I don't think and that's the cool point. I'm glad you brought that up. There's certain people like me. I just, one day I sold my one business that I owned, and then I started Positive Polarity the next day. And there was no real transition. It was easy, no big deal. There are plenty of people that do it exactly the way Deirdre does it, is that you kind of transition. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I'm glad that there's different people with different ways, so that we can definitely learn all those along the way. So cool. A couple questions. I'm gonna let you go. You have a new book coming out. So fill us in on what's going on there. I'm excited to learn.
Yeah, so it's called Virality Marketing, and it's basically I feel like it's a summary of all of the frameworks that I use day in, day out from a marketing perspective. So I call it's distilled down to the virality formula. So it goes through messaging, content, traffic, and I call it lead, attracting, conversion, event. And so it details those 4 key pillars and systemization, because for some reason I've become
that one word you don't like.
I know, exactly.
Don't put that in that book. That's crazy.
But yeah, so it's pretty cool. A lot of stories. I simultaneously had a lot of fun, but also wanted to throw my laptop out the window while hiding it. So it's good.
Absolutely. Well, and you're in New York, so it's easy to throw the laptop out the window. But you probably won't get it back. So one last question, and then I'm going to let you go. What would your tip of the week be for somebody listening, whether something we covered or something that's really you're seeing a lot of right now? What's a good tip of the week for you?
Yeah, so I think we already covered sort of, the power of storytelling and adding value. The last thing that I would probably just as a quick tip is, in amongst that, how do you, and this is kind of come back to content honey traps. I want people to think about how is it that you can create so much curiosity in your audience, in your content, to get them to go to the next stage with you.
Yeah.
That's if I leave with nothing else, it's how do you just create curiosity all the time.
Sure.
That's how you're going to hook people and want them to follow you through your front end and into your back end funnel.
And I tell you what, for everybody listening, I'm on the same spot that you are, that it sounds really easy to do, but it's really not, and that's why Deirdre's here. And I think that's a great transition here as we close today, is think about that. If you struggle with that, hopefully today, this has given you a little bit of insight on maybe I'm not as visible as I think. And maybe my story doesn't have as much emotion as it should. And maybe I'm not even telling stories. We joked about a plumber, but whatever your story is, if your customers don't know your story, I think you're missing a big chunk. So if that's you and you feel that you need some help with that, that's why I have had her on today. So Deirdre, if somebody's interested in learning more from you, wanting to connect with you, what's the best way for that to happen?
Yeah, so head over to my website. It's deirdretshien.com. I can spell it out because I know
it's easy to say, but hard to spell. And it's not easy to say either. I've been practicing all morning. So
Yeah, so DeirdreTshien.com. I'm on the same, like my full name on all of the socials as well. So DM me on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, wherever. And yeah, and if you want to, if there is anyone listening who has a podcast and wants to learn how to use that podcast to actually generate leads, then head over to Grow My Podcast Show.
growmypodcastshow.com.
Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for carving out some time to unpack this with us. And again, if you're listening, I say this pretty much every week now, you have a choice right now. You have learned something, and the curve of forgetting in our human brain says 80% of what you just learned, you will forget in 48 hours without some type of reinforcement. Maybe it's going to her website. Maybe it's connecting with her on LinkedIn. Maybe it's listening to the show again. Whatever it is, if there's something that stirred within you today, I would much rather that you do something with it than not, because there was some great information. And if you ask your customers and they don't feel emotionally connected to you, then hopefully this is your opportunity to change that. So thank you, Deirdre, for coming on and hanging out with us. Good luck on your new book, and can't wait to read it and can't wait to keep following you and learning more from you.
Thank you so much, Dave. This was such a fun chat.